Sparks Steakhouse is not only regarded as one of New York City's top steakhouses, but was also a former mob hangout. In fact, crime boss Paul Castellano and his bodyguard were assassinated right in front of the restaurant under orders from John Gotti. I, however, was at Sparks for steak, and there were certainly aspects about the restaurant that I really liked and others that I did not.
Today it's a beautiful day here in New York City. Right now I'm relaxing / recovering from the pretty filling meal I had earlier today at one of the city's most notable steakhouses. I went to Sparks Steakhouse here in Midtown Manhattan for lunch today, and they're of course known for their steak, but they're probably more famous for the fact that they were somewhat of a mafia hangout spot. In fact, Sparks is the site of one of the most infamous mob hits of all time when Paul Castellano and his bodyguard were gunned down right in front of the restaurant. For some, one of the main intrigues with Sparks is that sort of mafia connection, but for me, I was all about the food. Now, like most carnivores, I love steak, and it's been a while since I've actually been to a steakhouse, so I thought today would be the perfect day to give Sparks a try. The spot has always been on my list of places to try, plus it's gotten pretty decent reviews, and I was hyped to dine there. So this was my experience at the legendary Sparks Steakhouse.
Sparks was founded in 1966 when Italian immigrants Pasquale and Mike Cheta purchased Sparks Pub on East 18th Street. They converted the establishment into a steakhouse, but in 1977 they moved the restaurant to its current location in Midtown Manhattan. It was in 1985 that Sparks was thrust into the national spotlight when just before 5:30, crime boss Paul Castellano stepped out of his car in front of Sparks and was gunned down by multiple assassins who also killed his bodyguard. It was John Gotti making a power move for the Gambino crime family who arranged the hit. Today, this mob connection to Sparks is well known and is a draw to the restaurant for a number of customers. I, however, was more interested in the food, so I went to Sparks for lunch at 12 p.m. on a Monday. The restaurant is huge. According to Sparks' website, the establishment can seat 684 customers. Even though that it was pretty clear that Sparks is big, I still didn't see how the restaurant could fit that many people inside. But then I saw printed on their menus that Sparks has 10 private party rooms available. Seriously, Sparks makes airports look small. Now, I've seen plenty of photos of Sparks, but none of them do the interior justice. It's such a classic looking restaurant. In fact, it feels a lot older than it actually is, and I mean that in a good way. However, the atmosphere wasn't perfect. There was no music playing whatsoever, and there weren't many customers. This gave Sparks sort of a somber feel that I just wasn't a fan of. Now, I bet it's a different story during the prime dining hours of the evening, but I just don't know why the restaurant didn't even have any music playing. After I settled in, I began exploring the menu, which was physically massive. There's a decent selection of appetizers with a slight focus on shellfish, but I was going straight for the steaks. Unfortunately, Sparks doesn't have the best selection when it comes to steak. It seems like there's only a sirloin steak and a filet mignon, with the rest of the options being dishes utilizing similar cuts with different added components. Now, the medallions of beef and the steak fromage do sound good, but personally, I would like to see some more pure cuts of steak offered, like a ribeye or a porterhouse. Still, a restaurant can get by and make a reputation off a single dish, and Sparks is famous for their prime sirloin steak, which was exactly what I got. I then took a look at the wine list, which was right on the back of the regular menu. The physical size of this wine menu is just massive. I mean, it practically takes up the whole table. Sparks definitely has a good selection of wine, and to see it all listed out on 2 physically imposing pages was very impressive. I also have to say that the prices for the wine were pretty reasonable and fair, especially in comparison to other Manhattan steakhouses. However, I just wanted a glass of wine, and wines by the glass along with other beverages weren't listed with the bottles of wine, so I had to request a separate menu with that information. I decided to get a glass of the J Vineyards Pinot Noir from California. I thought that it was a pretty delightful wine. It had a good smooth body and a very nice flavor. Although I probably would have appreciated a more robust wine like a Cab or a Bordeaux to pair with my steak, but nevertheless, I really enjoyed my selection. Next, I turned my attention to the bread, which was paired with a very disproportional amount of butter. The bread were these sort of sesame seed rolls. really liked the bread. It was warm and fresh, and the sesame seeds provided good flavor. The rolls had a nice crisp exterior while maintaining a fluffy interior. The bread was no doubt solid, but I only had one roll. I had to save my stomach space for the steak, which I didn't have to wait very long for. I of course got the prime sirloin steak. On the menu, Sparks describes the dish as a boneless shell steak from premium steers. However, it doesn't list the actual weight of the cut, but I asked my server and he said that it was about 13 ounces. Appearance-wise, it was definitely a good-looking piece of meat and I couldn't wait to take my first bite. The steak was delicious. First off, the meat had such an incredible sear. From top to bottom, the wonderful charred crust of the steak provided a fantastic textural sensation that really enhanced the flavor of the beef. In addition, the sirloin was seasoned perfectly. There wasn't anything complex about the seasoning, and it was probably just seasoned mainly with salt, but it worked. Sometimes you just can't beat simplicity. The beef was also pretty tender, which made a wonderful textural contrast with the charred crust of the steak. Overall, it was pretty clear why the dish is a staple of the restaurant. However, my steak wasn't perfect. I requested it to be cooked to a medium rare, and sadly the meat was more on the medium side. Now, like I said, the steak was still delicious, and missing the temperature by a degree isn't the worst thing in the world, but the reality is the steak could have been better. In addition, the meat had a good beefy flavor, but it didn't have as rich of a flavor as a properly aged steak. I don't know if it was dry aged or not. There's nothing printed about it on the menu. In fact, it could have very well been wet aged since the meat was very tender. However, because the steak was so well seasoned, juicy, and nicely charred, it made up for the lack of any strong flavors from the beef. In addition, I thought it was still a very delicious steak, but it could have been a little better if it was medium rare. Plus, like I said, I really enjoyed the rich flavors of a nicely aged steak, and that sirloin didn't quite hit the mark in that regard. But don't get me wrong, I still had a great time eating that steak, sipping my wine, and enjoying my side, the sauteed mushrooms. In regards to the sides at Sparks, they pretty much have most of the steakhouse classics. They're not the most interesting sides, but they're classics for a reason. Since I felt like I've stuck to choosing mainly potato dishes and cream spinach lately at steakhouses, I decided to mix it up a bit by getting the sauteed mushrooms. The mushrooms were pretty solid. Now, there was nothing special about them. They didn't have any unique seasoning or sauce, but they were properly cooked and tasty. The portion size of the side was decent. Even though I've had larger sides at steakhouses, the sizes at Sparks weren't bad. Plus, the mushrooms paired pretty well with my steak. Even though I ordered a decent amount of food, I had no problem finishing it all and still had room for dessert. Just like the regular menu, the dessert list was also physically pretty sizable. A lot of the typical desserts are offered, like cheesecake and tiramisu, but there were also some unique options like a strawberry Romanoff. In addition, Sparks also has a great list of after-dinner drinks. After contemplating the offerings, I decided to go with the walnut pecan pie a la mode. When the dish was presented to me, I was a bit perplexed. The pie looked deflated. There was no body to it whatsoever. Thankfully, the dish tasted great, but honestly, I don't know what the hell happened to that pie. It basically felt like I was just eating nuts on top of pie crust, but with very little filling to bind everything together. I've seen pictures of the dish before on Google reviews and Yelp, and the pie looked a lot better than what I had. Honestly, I'm sort of surprised the restaurant would even serve a dish that was somewhat visually off. But like I said, luckily it still tasted pretty good. The pie was nice and warm, which made for a wonderful contrast with the cool and smooth ice cream. Overall, I still really enjoyed the dish, but it was clear that the restaurant should have done a better job with the presentation. In summation, I largely had a good experience at Sparks, but there were definitely some things that I didn't like. Visually, I loved the look of the restaurant, but the lack of music and people just didn't give the place the best feel. For a steakhouse, I wasn't impressed with the menu. There's basically more diversity with the seafood than the beef. Although I definitely would love to try some of their seafood offerings on my next visit, but when the restaurant is labeled as a steakhouse, it brings about certain expectations. Thankfully, their sirloin really is a great piece of meat, but I would have liked mine to be cooked properly. GQ food correspondent and 16-time James Beard Award winner Alan Richmond also pointed out the restaurant's inconsistent cooking with their steaks in his review of Sparks. But like I said, it was still a good steak that I enjoyed even though it wasn't perfect. After finishing my dessert, it was time for the bill. My total came to $135.93, but with my tip, I spent about $161. Yeah, my wallet was a bit lighter after that visit, but my stomach was nice and full.
So that was a pretty nice lunch, a pretty filling meal, and definitely a nice way to spend some time away from work. I really enjoyed myself at Sparks today, but I don't think it's one of the best steakhouses in New York City. It's certainly a good steakhouse, but it's not top tier to me. One of the big issues I feel like is their menu. Frankly, it's just too limited in terms of their steak offerings. I mean, there's no ribeye, there's no porterhouse, all of the steak options seem to come in the same size. Personally, when it comes to steakhouses, I just like menus with a little more diversity. Fortunately, I did enjoy my sirloin, but it definitely would have been better if it was a medium rare instead of a medium. Still, it was a good steak. My side of mushrooms was solid. My dessert was definitely tasty, but the execution I thought fell a little short. Basically, it felt like I was eating nuts on top of pie crust. It was good, but it could have been better. In terms of the atmosphere, it probably would have been better if there were more people in the restaurant or if there was music playing, but in terms of the design of the room itself, that was pretty cool looking. It's got those classic steakhouse vibes for sure. Regarding the service, it was solid. I liked my server, the food came out at a good pace. Yeah, I have no complaints in that department. Overall, I had a fairly good experience at Sparks. I think it's definitely a good steakhouse, although I do not think it is one of the best steakhouses in New York City. But I like their history, the food was good, and I'll definitely go back.